Welcome to the Medical Missions Unfiltered podcast, a branded podcast of the Jonah Inheritance, a nonprofit organization that's seeking to pave the way for a new kind of healthcare in Africa, the kind that's gospel-centric, native, and self-sustaining. We are your co-hosts. My name is Ruth Gatto Coleman.
And I am Dr. Sam Khan Gatto.
And we are the co-founders of the Jonah Inheritance. Our goal with these podcasts is to share stories from perspectives that may not have been considered before. On today's episode, we are going to discuss our first medical trip. So the previous episode, we talked about the origin, how we came to the idea of the Jonah Inheritance, formalized it in our thought process. So this episode, we wanted to give you guys the behind the scenes look of what our 2021 medical trip is. And we wanted to focus on the native component of our methodology. So as I stated before, we're seeking to pave the way for a new kind of healthcare in Africa, the kind that's gospel-centric, native, and self-sustaining. And we believe that that's really the key in the next evolution of what medical missions looks like in developing countries like our home country of Nigeria. So let's talk about the 2021 medical trip. I think one of the things about that trip was, I always say that Nigeria's most underrated asset is its people. Nigeria is a country that has over 206 million people. And, you know, this trip really gave us a unique perspective on, I think, the resiliency of our people, the talent of our people, and even some of the issues that they face. But let's back up and talk about the trip, why we felt it was important to go on this trip, and then what we did on this trip.
Yeah, I remember thinking that trip for me was not going to be primarily medical.
Right.
I knew that at this point we were a formalized organization and that there was so much that needed to be ironed out and that was non-medical. Mm-hmm. And I didn't think that we were well equipped to dispense a lot of medical services. And so there wasn't as much time for that, which, as a matter of fact, there wasn't any time set apart for that. But when I showed up, it was just it was hard not to actually do that. And we can talk about that a little bit more. So my goal was really just to develop the groundwork. And at that point, mom and dad had been, they're still there, but they had given us a lot of people that they felt like it would be worth for us to meet and to know and to just build a consensus.
Right.
So when we arrived, our goal was to, establish a relationship with Bingham University Teaching Hospital. I mean, if you're going to build a hospital, if you're going to build a medical system, you need to identify a source of physicians. And thankfully, we had a relationship with Bingham University and they have a medical school. And so
they've been there for a while, too.
Exactly. I think leveraging their experience was very, very important, and kind of sitting at their feet and learning what we could was the idea. And then at that point, we were also looking at land. This was our second robust attempt. Mm-hmm. Our dad had been looking and had found a few potential parcels that were worth looking, and so we were that for me was also a very important part of that trip was identifying a property, and so I think that was that ended up being and thirdly, it wasn't intended to be medical, but it ended up being medical, and it gave us some pretty insightful information. So all three were accomplished. In terms of, we got answers to all three questions. They weren't necessarily the answers we wanted, but they were the answers we got.
I think, so the goal for that trip was to lay the groundwork for the Jonah Inheritance Medical Center. It was to establish relationships with our local partners. And I think it was also, to do a pre-feasibility study, to really get on the ground, to listen, and to see the landscape. And so it was about a week, or maybe 10 days, a very full week. And so we spent the first half of it was it looking at properties, right?
Um, so I think we bookended that trip
Yeah.
looking at properties. We looked at properties when we first got there because we came in through Abuja, and then as we were leaving, we looked at more properties. And so those were, we looked at several parcels. We found one that we really liked that was ideally suited.
Yeah.
It took us a while to kind of come. I mean, at that point, we had been looking for several years. So since 2018, we'd been trying to identify the ideal place to have a medical center. That was, to us, it was very important to be in the capital because of the resources available, and supply chain networks were more reliable. Security was less of a concern in the capital city, and travel in and out was easier. Oftentimes, it's hard enough to get to Nigeria, but then it's very, very difficult to come to Nigeria and then to drive 4 or 5, 6 hours or whatever to get to where.
Which is where Booth is.
Yeah. So we thought that if we're going to start a hub and spoke model, then the hub needs to be centrally located, and Abuja is centrally located. So we found several parcels that we actually moved on, but we just weren't able to. We weren't able to find anything, and we got outbid a few times. But it actually ended up working out well.
It did. It did. I know we were devastated. We found a property when we left the trip and said, "Okay, this is it." And then 2 weeks later, somebody bought it, and then we ended up we ended up obtaining a property that was even better suited.
Yeah, and I think this is a great example of why it's important to actually have solutions come from the indigenous people. Because one of the things that we were doing, we were looking through using the traditional approach of finding land. We were finding. I know I was calling realtors, and I was looking at properties online, and the cost was just astronomical. But then Dad had someone that he mentored over 20, 30 years ago, who was pastoring a church, who he enlisted to help us find the property. And he was relentless. And he was relentless. And so he was living in that area. And so he just knew that in Nigeria, there's property available that's not formally listed on real estate sites. And so he knew that there was a 40-hectare property a couple miles from his church. And that was through his relationships, we were able to get at least 7.5 hectares, which comes out to about 12 acres of property, and that was, and we were able to find that at a very affordable rate, and it actually ended up being better than anything that we had looked at before. It was cheaper, it was bigger, it was better located, it was right off of a main artery. It was undeveloped,
right?
And there was room for expansion,
right.
And there was water on site, and everything that we needed, and it provided, and that just came from relying on indigenous networks.
So let's talk about. So we're talking about the native piece. So let's talk about the key individuals that we came across on this trip that really, I think I left away that really inspired us. I think, and we're really knowledgeable about the healthcare landscape in Nigeria, the healthcare sector. So let's talk about Manasan, who I think we didn't even plan on meeting him. It was Uncle Yaya, who's on our board. He gave us a call and was like, "You guys need to meet this person."
Yes.
And I think I remember this. I remember when you met him, you were so glued. You had your laptop open. You were taking notes. I think you were so blown away by just the wealth of information. It was almost as if it was like this gold was just dropped on our lap. So
Yeah.
talk about who, his expertise and just that discussion.
Yeah, that was really another scenario of just things being better than you hope or expect. So we knew we were going to need ancillary services. We knew we were going to need a pharmacist. We knew we need a lab, and we knew we were going to need imaging. But the emphasis at that time going in the trip was really more on the medical component.
Mm-hmm.
Who are the medical practitioners who are actually going to be delivering the care. And so we had spent time and effort in finding physicians who are capable, and we felt like we make really good relationships with people that we could move them forward. But then while we were there, our uncle, who for years worked for Shell and traveled globally and was pretty well connected in Nigeria, had developed a relationship with Manasseh Rubenu, and he said, I really think if you're interested in developing a medical center and you intend to have laboratory services, I think you really need to talk to this man. And out of sheer respect, because he's our uncle and he's on the board, it was like, okay, let's just take the time to meet him. And so we drove a long way. And the irony is this is part of the process of us. This is part of how we actually came to find the land, because we weren't necessarily looking in that area, but once we actually met him, we found out that the area in which he lived was ideally suited, and that's when we started looking for property at that site. But then when we met him, my mind was blown away that this man had not only was he qualified, but he had a skill set that we could leverage and could stand alone on itself. And so he had a laboratory of his own in which he performed basic lab tests, but even more advanced tests, PCR testing. And for those, I think PCR testing has become somewhat mainstream with COVID testing, but it's pretty advanced testing. Western blot, assays, things of that nature. These are tests that are really helpful to help distinguish and diagnose specific diseases. And here he was, not in a medical facility, not in a government hospital, in his own lab that he had spent years accumulating this equipment and doing this. He had retired, and he started his own lab and was doing really, really well.
Yeah.
He was ethical. And the more we talked, the more we found out he was essentially the president of the Nigerian or the governing body for laboratory services in Nigeria.
Yeah.
So it was his job to accredit and to make sure any lab that was made and that was running a facility in Nigeria was credentialed and was keeping a standard of quality that was safe. And that's the type of person you want working for you.
Yeah.
That's the type of person you want running a laboratory. And then additionally, during that visit, we ended up finding out that he was performing tests. He was one of the few people in the country who was actually able to perform those PCR, those assay studies that, for the most part, were being shipped over to South Africa. So hospitals in Nigeria that needed these tests done would traditionally send them to a government facility in Abuja, which would then send them to South Africa. And then once those studies were done, the results were shipped. But he was doing it himself.
Right.
And he said if there was a way that we could scale this up, then we could. That's another way to stay sustainable. That we could essentially market our services, and we could save the system and these hospitals significant money. Patients would be getting the results much quicker if we developed a system and an infrastructure where we were receiving the tests and getting them the results within days as opposed to weeks. And so when all this became, in our conversations with him, I was just thinking to myself, this is amazing. Like, he, in and of himself, you could build a system and an infrastructure that helps it be sustainable just on the skill set of this man alone.
Right.
And right then and there, we just said, "Hey, this
I
is
remember.
this is what we're doing,
Yeah.
and we're willing to come around you and give you whatever tools that you need. Will you
Mm.
join us?" And he said, "Absolutely, I'm on
Absolutely.
board." And
Yeah.
so we've been working with him ever since.
Yeah. And then the next person was Auntie Doris.
Yeah,
Doris Umlai, who is a pharmacist by trade.
correct.
Mhm.
Yeah.
So let's talk about.
Yeah, she once again, this is just the strength of we're loving relationships that our mother and father have formed for a while,
Yeah.
and so
And hence why they're the national directors in
yeah,
Nigeria.
they're yes, because they play such a crucial role.
Mhm.
But our aunt, and I just knew her to be my favorite aunt. I never really thought I knew she was a pharmacist, but I didn't really have the scope to understand
Yeah.
how much like what kind of pharmacist she was.
And what kind of giant she is in her field.
In her field, exactly. Yeah. So she just recently retired, and she has her own pharmacy. But suffice to say, her job was she worked for NAFDAC, which is the equivalent of the federal, the FDA, or the Federal Drug Administration here in the United States. And so she held the top position in NAFDAC, or the FDA, Nigerian FDA, at one point in her career. So
Right.
she was the head pharmacist for the country. And her job was quality control and ensuring that all the pharmacies had were giving medicines that were actually what they were labeled as. And her job was to make sure that pharmacies were dispensing safe medicine, excuse me. And so we'd known that she was a pharmacist. So when we reached out to her and just said, "Hey, can you help us, direct us put us in the right direction?" The more we talked, the more we realized, oh my goodness, this is the third pharmacy. She's currently running her third pharmacy. She's turning a profit, but she's running the pharmacy in a very rural part of Nigeria,
right,
with very limited resources, and is
right,
still able to actually cover her overhead and,
right,
and pay her expenses. But she's using her own money, and it
right,
was very, very intensive. And so then I asked the question, we know you're retired, and we don't necessarily see you as our long-term option, but can you help us
right.
get started? Can you head up our pharmaceutical services, and can you train your replacement? She said, "That sounds great." So I don't have to stay in the job. And I was like, "No, we just, but the beautiful thing about both of them that I found, and I think I've learned this from people who have run organizations, is that you have to find people who absolutely love what they do, and they don't see it as their job.
Right.
And what I loved about Manasan and what I love about Auntie Kate was that they were,
Auntie Doris.
Yeah, Auntie Doris. Is what I loved about them is that they were doing things like they had already had their careers, but they were continuing to practice their specialty because they enjoyed doing it, and it brought them fulfillment. And so those are the types of people that you want to build an organization.
Yeah, right.
Around. And so in talking about Auntie Doris, she was just, it was wonderful, because it was just like, yes, this is we not only have somebody who has the clinical skills to deliver a safe service, but she loves it. And so it was just yet another, here are homegrown solutions.
Yeah.
And the beautiful thing about both of them is they have the expertise to navigate the bureaucracy.
Exactly.
And they've done this before. They've done this in a government setting, and now they're doing it in a private setting, and they know how to now cut through the red tape.
Yeah. And I think the beauty about, as you said, about both of them, and I highlighted this in the beginning, is that you have Nigerian people that are invested in solving the problems that Nigerians face. And I think they're doing it from a micro perspective. They're doing it in their own individual sphere and doing the best that they can with what they have. And I think what we bring with the Jonah Inheritance is that we are now mobilizing all those individuals towards one goal and are able to accelerate the progress by doing that. And I think that's really the missing piece. You have people doing, portions of the work in their own sphere, just need the resources, need the opportunity. And so we kind of fill in that gap to really bring people together, Nigerians that are homegrown, that understand the context, that have the same vision and mission and same heart towards addressing this.
Yeah.
So I wanted to pivot towards just talking about how we ended the trip and Musa's story, the patient that you operated on for 4 hours. So we arrive at Bingham University. So after talking to all these individuals, we arrive at Bingham University Teaching Hospital. You did some training. You taught some classes to the medical students and the residents. And then didn't really have a full intention of seeing a lot of patients or doing the medical piece, because this was more of like a fact finding. We were going to do some medical stuff, I think, but then like the need is so great. And so now, you can't say no when nurse Aldous comes with a list of patients with ENT conditions and you're an ENT surgeon. And so the first case, was he the first case?
I don't remember whether he was a first case or not. What I do remember is that you're right, in the sense that I'd planned on being in clinic.
Right.
So I was lecturing that morning and I thought I'll just do a couple hours in clinic. But Mr. Ardou came up and said, I don't need you in clinic.
Yeah.
I need you performing surgeries.
And just to say, so Mr. Ardou is a nurse. He's a head ENT nurse for Booth, our local partner, their clinic. He's been there for close to, I think, 20 years, right?
Yeah. Yes, he's been there for a long time. And it was definitely, it was unexpected, but it was one of those situations where you just have to kind of go with the flow. And so he came up to me and said that, hey, I have this patient who has a denture lodged in his throat. And when I first heard that, I was like, that's not a problem. We can get that done fairly quickly. But as I mentioned before, we had established good relationships with several physicians, and one of them that's been working with us came and said, hey, he came in to say hi. He wasn't planning on being there for a long time, and so we were going over the charts together. And he said to me, he asked him some information. He got some more information and found out that the patient had the denture for 7 months in his throat. And I've never really heard of that before, because in the United States, if you have a denture in your throat, you don't wait more than a day before you show up and get that taken care of. So I've actually dealt with that before. I've seen that problem here in the States multiple times, and usually you just go in and you remove it because it's not been there for a long time. But then, because this is a different setting, our physician said, be careful, because this is going to be harder than you think. I think it's going to be wedged in there. And so I went in, thankfully, appropriately warned that this may not come out as easily. We put him to sleep. I go through the instruments, which are really not good.
Yeah.
And I thought to myself, this is kind of dangerous by itself, just because the equipment wasn't what we needed. And so we had to use equipment that was designed not for the esophagus, but for the windpipe.
Wow, I didn't know that.
And ideally, the medicine, the equipment doesn't really go that far. If it was designed for the windpipe, so it's not designed to go significantly far, but it was the esophagus goes deeper, and so that's part of what made it difficult. And then the graspers, or the equipment that you use to actually pull the dentures, were just not really good, and they were rusty, they were old, and so I had to find something that was the least rusty. I had to disinfect it thoroughly, and we put him to sleep, and I couldn't reach. But the only other option was, if we weren't able to get it out, we were going to have to open his neck, and I was greatly concerned about having to open his neck.
Because that could almost be a death sentence
Exactly.
in this context, because it's a
Exactly.
more complicated surgery.
Exactly. And I was not, I did not have the resources to open his neck and to repair. I'm an ear, nose, and throat surgeon, but I don't typically work on the esophagus. I work on the windpipe. And so
Okay.
if he had been, if that had been there for a long time and I had to open his neck, I had to be prepared to go into his esophagus, but then I would need to sew it. And that is a challenge because it would need to heal, and he couldn't eat because you'd have to wait for his esophagus to heal. Because if he ate, food would leave his esophagus from the surgical site and go into his chest, and it could kill him. So opening his neck was just not an option, or was the last option that I wanted to avoid. And so, using very bad equipment, we were able to slowly but surely just break apart the denture and then separate it from the surrounding tissue, which it was heavily scarred. And then, but to separate that tissue without breaking into his esophagus was a challenge. And so it took 4 hours to do that until we could get it all out safely. And as much as I could see, I couldn't see any tear in his esophagus, but we had to keep him in the hospital for several days with a feeding tube to make sure that he didn't use his esophagus to eat because he had to heal.
Yeah.
Now, this man was in this situation because the system, he knew he'd swallowed the denture as soon as it happened. He'd been to many doctors, and he didn't have the appropriate imaging to be able to tell us where exactly it was.
And there's like so for something like that, you need a CT, right?
Well, a CT is helpful, yes. But then there's also a special kind of X-ray that can be helpful as
And
well.
nobody in the area had that kind of.
No, he didn't. No, and he was
All
told.
the hospitals in the area did not have it.
And it's not so much the X-ray; it's the dye. You swallow a dye that is able to show you where things are in the esophagus, and that was not easily available. Short story short, he had been to several physicians, and they essentially told him that it was going to pass on its own. But after several months or weeks, it's not going to pass on its own. But no one was skilled enough to go in. So this was something that's specific for ENT, but there's only 250 in the whole country. So I happened to be in the country when that happened, and so I had the skill set to do it, even though it was very, very difficult. But even, this could have been prevented if
Yes.
there was a system where he can just go in and have it removed in literally 5-10 minutes as soon as it happened. But that shows, I love that story because that really informed that there were so many things that needed to happen for his success.
Right.
And one of them was the fact that one of our indigenous partners knew what to expect, helped prepare me to brace for a much longer surgery. If he had imaging services, this could have been, this could have allowed us to know exactly where we were going. And he was admitted for a week afterwards. Ended up finding out that he did well because we needed to make sure that he didn't develop an infection in his chest that could have ultimately killed him from just the surgery. And thankfully, that didn't happen.
Yeah.
And so this man needed, he needed both medical, surgical, laboratory, and pharmaceutical or imaging and pharmaceutical services just to get the complete care. And thankfully, he had a good outcome. But some people just don't have that chance.
Yeah. Well, I mean, for me, I have to say I was a proud sister because I watched this whole exchange from the beginning to the end. When he came in, the consultation, realizing it's going to be a more complicated surgery, bringing his father in to educate him and say, look, this is your option. If I can't get it out, this is the other option. And they're saying you go ahead and proceed. And then understanding and seeing, in your face, wanting to do it right, knowing you don't have the proper equipment. And then the 4-hour surgery, we're sitting there waiting and just hoping everything turns out fine. And then, Lord willing, it did.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we left that trip, for both of us, reinforced that we are on the right track. and just seeing the humanity of how it really tangibly affects someone, because he was 26 years old.
He was young.
He was at the prime of his life, and this could have been something that's deadly. And so I think that trip was really a good foundation for the work that we want to do and the work that we did. It really informed us. I think it helped me have an even greater appreciation for our people and their resilience and their commitment. They're just not sitting idly and saying, okay, well, this situation, there's nothing I can do about it. They're being resourceful and trying to figure out how to, have a workaround solution for it. So thank you guys so much for just being a part of this episode and listening in. We have a lot more episodes, and we look forward to you guys being a part of it.